The captured Soviet PPSH-41 submachine gun felt alien in Audie Murphy's hands as he crouched behind the shattered remains of what had once been the village church. 3 days of house-to-house fighting in this nameless Italian hill town had stripped away any illusions about routine operations. The morning air carried the acrid bite of cordite mixed with the damp smell of old stone and splintered wood. Intelligence had promised light resistance, a few scattered Wehrmacht stragglers holding defensive positions before withdrawing north toward the Gothic line. Instead, Murphy's company had walked into a carefully prepared trap where every building had been turned into a fortress. The PPSH-41's distinctive drum magazine caught the weak January light filtering through the broken roof tiles above. Sergeant Collins shifted beside him, adjusting his M1 Garand with the practiced movements of a man who trusted familiar tools. "That spray-and-pray piece of junk won't hit anything past 50 yards, he muttered, eyeing the foreign weapon with obvious skepticism. "Might as well throw rocks at them." Murphy said nothing, testing the weapon's balance and checking the drum magazine's weight. 71 rounds of 7.62mm ammunition, if he'd counted the load correctly. The submachine gun had belonged to a German machine gunner who'd been using it to devastating effect from a second-story window until Murphy's rifle shot had ended the threat. When he'd stripped the weapon and its ammunition from the position, Private Henderson had joked nervously about relying on enemy equipment. "Russians built it, Krauts used it, now we're stuck with it." What could go wrong? The tactical situation stretched before them like a puzzle with too many missing pieces. German positions controlled the main square, with machine gun nests positioned in the ruins of what had been a small hotel and several shops. Sniper fire from the church bell tower across the plaza had already claimed 2 men from their depleted platoon. The only route back to friendly lines required crossing 200 yards of open ground, swept by overlapping fields of fire, and radio contact remained sporadic at best. Murphy counted his remaining M1 clips, only 4 left, barely enough for sustained contact. The PPSH-41 offered more immediate firepower, but its limitations gnawed at him. In conventional tactical thinking, the weapon lacked the range and precision needed for this kind of engagement. Yet something about the enemy's positioning suggested they expected conventional responses to an unconventional problem. Lieutenant Morrison had caught shrapnel in his chest during the first day's fighting, leaving Murphy as the most experienced combat soldier in what remained of the squad. At 19, he carried the weight of decisions that should have belonged to men with more years and rank. The other soldiers looked to him for answers he wasn't sure he possessed, their hollow-eyed exhaustion mixing with the kind of trust that developed only under fire. As dawn broke fully over the shattered town, Murphy studied the machine gun nest in the hotel's ground floor. The position commanded the square effectively, but its field of fire was limited by debris from collapsed upper stories. A plan began forming in his mind. Desperate, improvised, born from 3 days of watching careful tactics fail against an enemy who had turned urban warfare into deadly art. "What are you thinking?" Collins asked, following Murphy's gaze toward the German strongpoint. Murphy hefted the PPSH-41, feeling its foreign weight. Sometimes the enemy's expectations became their greatest weakness. Sometimes tools designed for one purpose could accomplish what precision instruments couldn't achieve. The thought both terrified and steadied him as he prepared to explain a plan that would either break the tactical deadlock or get them all killed. If stories like this make you imagine what you'd do under fire, tell us in the comments how you think you'd react in this situation. And stay with us for the next chapters. The German machine gun position in the hotel's ground floor had been carefully sited to control the central square, but 3 days of observation had revealed its limitations. Murphy explained his assessment in whispers, sketching rough angles in the dust with his finger, while Collins and the remaining squad members, Henderson, Rodriguez and Thompson, listened with the focused attention of men whose survival depended on understanding every detail. The MG-42's got good coverage of the square, but look at all that debris from the upper floors, Murphy said, pointing toward chunks of masonry that had created irregular blind spots. If someone moves fast enough and close enough, they might get inside the weapon's traverse before the gunners can adjust. Collins studied the tactical problem with experienced eyes. That's 30 yards of open ground, minimum. And what happens when you get there? That Russian burp gun might not have the punch to clear them out. The PPSH-41 lay across Murphy's knees, its unfamiliar design a constant reminder of how improvised their situation had become. He'd spent time during the night watches learning its quirks, the slightly different balance compared to his M1, the way the drum magazine affected the weapon's handling, the cyclic rate that could empty a full load in seconds if he wasn't careful with trigger discipline. Henderson shifted nervously, his young face showing the strain of 3 days under constant threat. What about the other positions? They'll have crossfire on anyone moving in the square. That was the heart of the tactical puzzle. The German defenders had positioned their weapons to provide mutual support, creating overlapping fields of fire that made conventional assault approaches nearly impossible. But Murphy had noticed something during the previous evening's probing attacks. When one position came under direct pressure, the others had to shift their attention to provide covering fire, creating brief windows of reduced coverage. "We hit them in sequence," Murphy explained. "Draw their attention to one sector while I move against the main position. The key is timing and making them react, instead of letting them control the engagement." Thompson, who'd been quiet through most of the discussion, finally spoke up. "And if the plan doesn't work? If you get caught in the open?" Murphy didn't have a good answer for that question, and his silence conveyed more than words could. They all understood the mathematics of their situation. Ammunition was running low, communication with higher headquarters remained intermittent, and the German forces showed no signs of withdrawing voluntarily. Staying in their current position meant slow attrition. Attempting to withdraw across open ground meant probable annihilation. The PPSH-41 represented something different, not necessarily better, but unexpected. Murphy had learned during his brief combat experience that sometimes survival depended on doing things the enemy didn't anticipate. The captured submachine gun was exactly the kind of weapon that shouldn't work in this tactical situation, which might be precisely why it could succeed. Rodriguez checked his rifle and looked toward the German positions. "When do we try it?" Murphy studied the morning light and listened to the distant sounds of artillery from other sectors of the Italian front. "Soon. They'll expect us to either dig in or try to pull back. They won't expect an assault with a weapon like this." He lifted the PPSH-41 again, its weight now familiar but still foreign. The plan forming in his mind violated most of what he'd learned about small unit tactics, but conventional approaches had already failed. Sometimes desperation became the mother of innovation, and sometimes the only way forward was through. The distant rumble of artillery from the main Italian front provided a constant backdrop as Murphy's squad prepared for what they all recognized might be their final action in this unnamed hill town. Radio static crackled intermittently from Henderson's field set, carrying fragments of communications from other units engaged along the Gothic line. The broader war continued around them, but their immediate world had contracted to a few hundred yards of rubble-strewn streets and the deadly geometry of German defensive positions. Collins distributed their remaining ammunition with the methodical care of a man who understood that every round might matter. 20 clips total for the Garans, he reported quietly, plus whatever's left in that Russian piece. Murphy hefted the PPSH-41, checking its drum magazine one final time. The captured weapon had become more than just a tool. It represented their departure from conventional tactics into the realm of desperate improvisation. He'd seen enough combat in Italy to understand that survival often depended on adapting to circumstances that no training manual could anticipate. Thompson positioned himself near the eastern wall of their makeshift strongpoint, from where he could observe the German sniper in the church bell tower. "Movement up there," he reported. "They're definitely watching us." The psychological pressure of constant observation wore on all of them. For 3 days, they'd been trapped in a deadly game where every exposure to enemy lines carried the risk of sudden death. Murphy had watched good men die from momentary lapses in caution, a helmet showing above cover, a rifle barrel catching the light, the simple human need to look at what threatened them. Rodriguez worked on the field radio, trying to establish contact with company headquarters. The intermittent communications they'd received suggested that their situation was part of a larger tactical picture where small units throughout the Italian campaign found themselves isolated and forced to improvise. "Still getting static," he reported, "but I think I heard something about reserves moving up from the south. Help might be coming, but Murphy knew they couldn't count on rescue arriving before their current ammunition ran out." The German forces had proven patient and professional, content to maintain pressure while avoiding costly assaults. They seemed willing to wait for the Americans to either attempt a breakout or simply run out of bullets. The plan Murphy had outlined required precise timing and more than a little luck. Collins would initiate contact with the German positions using traditional rifle fire, drawing their attention and return fire. During the confusion, Murphy would sprint across the open ground with the PPSH-41, hoping to reach effective range before the machine gunners could traverse their weapon to engage him. "Once I'm in position, you shift fire to support," Murphy explained again, "but don't expose yourselves unnecessarily. If this doesn't work, you'll need your ammunition for the next attempt." Henderson checked his rifle nervously. What if they expect something like this? What if it's a trap? The question hung in the cold morning air like their visible breath. Murphy had considered the possibility that the German defenders were simply waiting for them to make exactly this kind of desperate move. But analysis paralysis could be as deadly as reckless action, and their tactical situation offered no good alternatives. "Then we find out what happens when you use a weapon exactly opposite to how everyone expects it to work," Murphy said, shouldering the PPSH-41. The submachine gun's unfamiliar weight had become oddly comforting, a tangible reminder that conventional wisdom might not apply to their unconventional circumstances. "Would you follow the orders exactly, or trust what your own eyes and instincts tell you in a moment like this? Comment which path you take, and share this episode with someone who loves real human stories from history." The sprint across 30 yards of debris-littered ground stretched into an eternity, measured in heartbeats and the distinctive tearing sound of the German MG-42. Murphy had broken from cover exactly as planned. The PPSH-41 clutched against his chest as he ran low through the rubble of what had once been the village's main commercial district. Behind him, Collins and the others laid down covering fire with their M1s, the familiar crack of American rifles, mixing with the heavier reports of German weapons responding to the sudden assault. Everything depended on timing and the hope that 3 days of static positions had made the enemy gunners predictable in their responses. The machine gun nest in the hotel's ground floor reacted exactly as Murphy had anticipated. Their weapon began traversing toward him, but the accumulated debris from the building's damaged upper stories slowed their movement just enough to create the window he needed. Bullets chipped stone inches from his boots as he reached the hotel's side wall, his lungs burning from the sprint and the adrenaline surge of exposure to direct fire. The PPSH-41 felt unwieldy compared to his familiar Garand. But as he rounded the corner into the building's interior, the weapon's design purpose became immediately clear. At 15 yards, precision mattered less than the psychological impact of sustained automatic fire. The engagement lasted perhaps 20 seconds, But those seconds contained the compressed violence that would later be reduced to a few lines in an after-action report. Murphy's burst from the PPSH-41 caught the German gunners as they attempted to reposition their MG-42, the submachine gun's rapid fire forcing them away from their carefully prepared position. The weapon's reputation for inaccuracy became irrelevant at close range, where volume of fire and the shock of sudden assault mattered more than individual shot placement. In the confusion that followed, Collins and the others advanced from their positions, applying pressure that transformed the entire tactical situation. The Germans' strongpoint that had controlled the square for 3 days suddenly became untenable, as coordinated fire from multiple directions overwhelmed the defenders' ability to respond effectively. Murphy found himself among the wreckage of the machine gun position, the PPSH-41's barrel radiating heat and the familiar post-combat tremor running through his hands. Around him, the sounds of battle shifted as the remaining German positions began to withdraw rather than risk being isolated and overrun. The tactical deadlock had broken, but the cost of that breakthrough would be calculated later in quiet moments when the immediate demands of survival no longer consumed every thought. The captured submachine gun had performed exactly as its designers intended, not as a precision instrument, but as a tool for close-quarters shock action where its limitations became irrelevant. Sometimes effectiveness came not from perfect tools used in ideal circumstances, but from imperfect ones, employed in ways that surprised both friend and enemy. Thompson reached Murphy's position first, his face showing the mixture of relief and disbelief that followed successful, desperate actions. Jesus, Audie, that was either the smartest thing I've ever seen or the craziest. Murphy sat among the ruins, the PPSH-41 across his knees, and tried to process what had just happened. The weapon that everyone, including himself, had considered inadequate for their tactical situation had succeeded precisely because its limitations were so well understood. The enemy had positioned themselves to defend against conventional rifle fire and careful advances, not against an assault with a close-quarters weapon used at the extreme edge of its effective range. The official after-action report would later describe the engagement in clean, precise language that bore little resemblance to the chaos Murphy had experienced during those crucial seconds inside the hotel ruins. What the citation couldn't capture was the moment when he'd nearly broken, when the reality of what he was attempting had hit him halfway across that open ground, and only momentum and the knowledge that his squad was watching had carried him forward. Collins found him sitting among the debris of the German position, the PPSH-41 still warm from firing. The familiar post-combat silence had settled over their section of the village, broken only by distant artillery and the occasional rifle shot from other sectors. "Radio's working again," Collins reported. "Company's sending a patrol to link up with us." But Murphy barely heard him. The successful assault had solved their immediate tactical problem. But it had also revealed something about himself that he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. During those seconds, when the German machine gun was traversing toward him, when bullets were chipping stone around his boots, he hadn't felt heroic or particularly brave. He'd felt terrified and oddly calm at the same time, as if some other version of himself was making the decisions while his conscious mind simply observed. Henderson approached carefully, carrying ammunition they'd stripped from the abandoned German positions. They left in a hurry, found maps and some intelligence material too. The tactical success was undeniable, but Murphy found himself thinking about the German soldiers who had defended this position for 3 days before being forced to abandon it. They'd been competent, professional fighters who'd simply been surprised by an approach they hadn't expected. In different circumstances, with different timing, the outcome could easily have been reversed. Rodriguez worked on establishing communication with higher headquarters, while Thompson and Collins secured the immediate area. The broader war was reasserting itself around them as radio messages brought news from other sectors of the Italian front. Their small action would become a footnote in reports that covered vast geographic areas and thousands of soldiers. But Murphy knew he would carry every detail of those 20 seconds for the rest of his life. The PPSH-41 lay beside him, its foreign design a reminder of how war mixed weapons and tactics in ways that no doctrine could anticipate. Russian engineers had designed it, German soldiers had captured and used it, and now an American squad had employed it to break a tactical deadlock in an Italian hill town whose name might not even appear on detailed maps. "What happens now?" Thompson asked, settling down beside Murphy with the weariness of a man who had survived 3 days of constant stress. Murphy didn't have a complete answer. The immediate threat had passed, but he could feel something changing inside himself, a recognition that he was becoming the kind of soldier who would take risks that rational men avoided. The thought both disturbed and steadied him, as if he was discovering capabilities he wasn't sure he wanted to possess. Collins studied the tactical situation with experienced eyes. "We hold here until the link-up patrol arrives, then probably move north toward the next objectives. The war would continue, carrying them toward other hill towns and other desperate improvisations. But Murphy knew that this morning would remain distinct in his memory, not because of any medal or citation, but because of the moment when he'd learned that sometimes survival required becoming someone you didn't entirely recognize. The link-up patrol arrived 2 hours later, led by a lieutenant who looked impossibly clean compared to Murphy's squad after 3 days in the ruins. Radio communications had been restored, ammunition resupplied, and the tactical situation stabilized as American forces continued their advance through the Italian hill country. But as Murphy shouldered his familiar M1 Garand and prepared to move out, the weight of the morning's action settled into his memory like sediment in still water. The PPSH-41 remained with the abandoned German equipment, its brief service with American forces ending as abruptly as it had begun. Murphy had considered keeping the weapon, but carrying foreign armament created logistical complications that outweighed any sentimental attachment. Still, he found himself glancing back at the submachine gun as they prepared to leave the village that had been their world for 3 days. Company headquarters would file reports that transformed their desperate stand into neat tactical language. The engagement would be described as a successful assault against prepared defensive positions, with emphasis on initiative and tactical flexibility. What wouldn't appear in any official document was the moment of pure terror when Murphy had realized he was committed to an action that violated every principle of small unit tactics he'd been taught. Collins walked beside him as they moved through the village streets toward their new objectives further north. "Think we'll see more fighting like that?" Murphy considered the question while studying the Italian countryside stretching before them. The war was far from over, and the German forces they faced showed no signs of collapse. If anything, the fighting seemed to be intensifying as the Wehrmacht conducted a series of fighting withdrawals designed to extract maximum cost from every mile of Allied advance. "Probably," Murphy said finally. "Seems like every town's got its own problems," but he was thinking about something broader than tactical challenges. The morning's action had revealed something about the nature of combat that training hadn't prepared him for. Real fighting often required improvisation that went beyond doctrine, and sometimes survival depended on making decisions that couldn't be justified through rational analysis. Years later, when Murphy was far from the Italian hill country and the sounds of war had faded into memory, he would sometimes smell diesel exhaust mixed with winter air and find himself back in that village square. The official records would describe his actions in language suitable for citations and commendations, but his own memories would focus on smaller details, The way the PPSH-41's unfamiliar weight had felt in his hands, the sound of bullets chipping stone, the moment when forward momentum became the only alternative to paralysis. Thompson appeared beside them, carrying the squad radio and wearing the expression of a man who was beginning to understand how much of the war still lay ahead. "Battalion says we're moving to new positions tomorrow. Sounds like more of the same." Murphy nodded, adjusting his equipment for the march ahead. The war would continue through the Italian mountains and beyond, carrying them all toward objectives and battles they couldn't yet imagine. But something had changed during those 3 days in the nameless village, not just in their tactical situation, but in his understanding of what combat required and what it cost. The PPSH-41 would remain in the ruins behind them, another piece of abandoned equipment in a war that mixed weapons and nationalities in patterns no staff officer could have predicted. But its lesson would travel forward with Murphy, that sometimes effectiveness came not from perfect tools or ideal tactics, but from the willingness to adapt when conventional wisdom proved insufficient to the demands of survival. If this story reminded you that behind every medal there's a human being carrying memories we'll never fully see, subscribe to the channel, tell us which country you watch from, and invite someone to revisit history with us in the next story.